Hi, welcome to Through the League Lens. My name is Elisa Campbell. This is the second of a three-part series we're doing about energy, using the information and the people from the League of Women Voters of Amherst Energy Committee, who put in a lot of time. They're writing a report that will be on their webpage, and we're doing 3 shows in a row so we can try to cover as much as possible of what they've learned, although of course there will be more in the report. The previous show we did was about energy efficiency and geothermal, and right now we're going to work on solar and wind, and our guests are Susan Millinger, who's going to talk about solar, and Peter Lillya, who's going to talk about wind. And I think we're going to start with you, right?
That's right, because I want to tell the audience that when we began this study of energy, which is such a vast topic, we decided that to be practical, we'd focus on New England. Because, for example, the electric power grid is sort of a New England entity. That's a meaningful entity separated from some of the rest of the country. And we also tried to focus on Massachusetts a little bit, on our own special situation here. We're keen to consider what can be done when older forms of generation like coal, which is slowly being replaced, disappear, or what would happen if we turn nuclear plants off. Many people would like to have nuclear plants turned off. What are the alternatives to this? So, in particular, we focused on renewable energy. And in looking at renewable energy, solar was one of the first we looked at. And we've come to the conclusion that solar has a tough time making it as a commercial technology in New England. Big solar farms are probably not going to happen, or they're not going to be very plentiful because we're quite a ways north and we have a lot of cloudy weather. On the other hand, smaller solar installations are quite practical, and Susan will talk about those. Wind, on the other hand, is very promising, and we eventually concluded that wind is probably going to be the most important form of renewable energy for the near future in New England. There are other possibilities. For example, people talk about tidal energy. It's certainly there, but it's not a mature technology at this point. It hasn't been developed to the point where it's practical. Biomass is another one, but the New England climate and geography doesn't lend itself to vast biomass farms, so it's not going to be a large contributor. Hydropower is another that we need to consider. Within New England proper, it's almost completely developed, so there's not a lot more to be gained.
Yeah, after all, in the 18th and 19th century, they put up a lot of dams for water power. And
absolutely. Some of those are causing us problems now because they're sort of ticking time bombs because they're not in good repair. But as power sources, of course, they're much too small to be practical. Hydropower will be considered eventually because we also have to consider importation of hydropower from Quebec, but that fell outside the purview of this report. But it will be important for people overall to consider. So going back to wind, why was wind then a practical technology if all of these others are not in the New England setting? And that's because New England actually has outstanding wind resources. If you look at maps that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory constructs of wind resources in the United States, you'll see that in the land, it's mainly concentrated in the middle of the country, in the Great Plains. But for offshore wind, which is actually the strongest, most dependable wind, New England is actually the sweet spot in the whole country. Amazing. California has a lot of strong winds, but they have very deep water immediately offshore, so it's hard to install wind turbines. We have both strong winds and shallow water. And so
Shallow meaning like 100 feet or something, not 5 feet.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Correct. Yeah. Not that you can wade in, but
Right.
you can install wind turbines in. So that's one reason why we'd like to think about wind power for New England. It's carbon free. The wind is free. So once the wind farm is installed, the cost is pretty constant. Any component of your energy generation system that you're using wind for, you're not yo-yoing up and down as the prices of fossil fuels change. We now think that natural gas is going to be cheap for the rest of our lifetimes, of course, because we've been
your
told,
lifetime and my lifetime.
yeah,
Right?
that you know, there's so much. But if you look back at energy history, the changes that happened and the price gyrations that happened for fossil fuels were completely unpredictable. People couldn't anticipate them. So to the extent we use wind energy, we've got some cost certainty in our schedules. Furthermore, we need to diversify in New England. In New England right now, we generate about 45% of our electricity with natural gas. It means we're very, very sensitive to the price of natural gas. This is good for us right now because natural gas is cheap, but it won't always be.
How does the natural gas get here?
Natural gas in two ways. It comes through pipelines, and in fact the pipelines are not sufficient for our needs. The University of Massachusetts cogeneration plant would like to fire entirely with natural gas, and it cannot get enough natural gas that's domestic. So it has to supplement its supply with natural gas that's shipped across the ocean in tankers in liquid form and then reliquefied at ports near Boston and piped across the state. So those are the two sources, and even though the United States itself is awash in gas, we can't get enough of it in New England to completely satisfy our needs yet. You would need to build new pipelines. Anybody out there want a pipeline through their backyard? You know, it's a problem.
Well, not to divert you from wind, but it's important to see the whole big picture here. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway,
Those are some of the reasons why you might want wind, but none of this stuff comes for free. There is a downside to everything. So let's look at wind energy from the downside. It's not very dependable. The wind sometimes blows and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it blows hard, sometimes it's weak. It's very difficult to forecast, much harder than solar to forecast. So you need reliable sources of energy to keep the grid running, and wind doesn't provide that all by itself. You have to have something to supplement it if you're going to have wind. One of the ways that this is mitigated is by having wind sources in many different places and combining them, because it's unlikely that the wind will die in all of them at the same time or be strong in all of them at the same time. So this is a small amount of mitigation, but it doesn't solve the whole problem. The wind energy can't be stored at the present time. There's no real practical way to store it. People have talked about storing it as compressed air, but nobody's demonstrated how that will be practical economically.
okay.
There are other problems. The wind isn't necessarily located where your load is located, so you may need more transmission lines to bring the wind from, say, western Maine down to Boston. Bring that energy down, and that's hard to do. So these are some of the problems that you have with wind. It doesn't come for free. And because our very best sources are offshore, we have to confront all of the extra problems that you have with offshore wind. It's not as mature a technology as onshore wind. Onshore wind is a mature technology. It's an enormous business worldwide, and it won't go away even if subsidies go away. Offshore wind is not quite so far along, so the costs are higher. And in fact, there are no offshore wind facilities in the US. Cape Wind, if it ever gets built, will be the first.
Right.
And it's suffering
Right.
for some of those reasons.
Yeah.
Things have to be tougher offshore. The winds are stronger, they have waves, there's salt being deposited on things, so corrosion is a big problem. It's more expensive to build and maintain offshore wind farms, so the electricity is more expensive right now. Only when the industry gets up to scale will there be real cost savings and will the costs come down. Onshore wind, if you have good sites, is actually competitive now with fossil fuel generation, although it may not be quite up to matching natural gas, since natural gas is so cheap now.
Well, we'll come back to this, but probably we should look at solar for a while here too. So I understand that you have a solar collector.
I do. I had solar panels put in September, so I haven't had them yet through the period of the year when it produces the most electricity. But I did it. I moved to Shutesbury a few weeks before the ice storm of 2008, and I decided I wanted something that would provide me with backup power. So when I got my system, I got batteries, which not everybody chooses to do, and it makes the system more expensive. You want to get a sense of how much mine costs?
Sure.
Okay, I'll come clean. Mine cost, and this is with 8 batteries, which should give me 3 days worth of power with no solar gain. My system cost about close to $37,500.
Wow.
But there are tax credits. There's a
Wait a
rebate.
minute, 37,500 or
37,500.
37,500.
Yep,
Okay. I just want to make sure I had all the
37,500.
zero. Yeah.
Yep. There's a Massachusetts rebate. Depending on how efficient your system is, you have to generate a certain amount of power before you can get the rebate. And you have to pay an application fee to apply for the rebate. But with the rebate and with the state tax credit and the federal tax credit, my system costs less than $20,000. And
You've had it now 4 or 5 years.
no, I got it this past September.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's new. It's quite new. And there are, obviously, one's electricity bill is lower. And then there are SRECs, solar renewable energy credits, which I get to sell on the market through an aggregator. I can only sell it when I have at least 1 megawatt to sell, and Massachusetts sets the price between $300 and $600 a megawatt.
So that's like on a really sunny day, you might have some megawatts you could sell?
Over a period of a couple months, I would generate a megawatt. My system is a 4.5 kilowatt, and it should generate somewhere in the vicinity of 4 to 5 megawatts a year. So potentially, I could be making somewhere between $1,200 more and dollars minimum for the system. So over a period of time, the system can pay for itself, and you have a system on your roof that's generating electricity for you.
Now, we've said earlier that small-scale solar like this is actually fairly practical at the homeowner level.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, and the cheaper way to get it is through leasing. If you lease, you cut your costs way down. And you get a set price for your electricity that's guaranteed for the life of your contract, which is probably 15 to 20 years.
So some company leases your roof or whatever. And
They provide
puts
the
up
panels. You pay for the installation fee, but there's a tax credit involved. And then you pay the set charge for the electricity generated.
And probably if there's any maintenance, they come out and
They
do
are
it.
responsible for maintenance, yes.
That could make it more practical for people who don't feel like they want to be rooftop
Oh,
mechanics.
I think definitely.
Is there a
Definitely
specific
peace of
example
mind.
of that in the league report, Susan?
Yes, there will be, because I
Okay.
got the data from one of the league members who has leased.
Oh,
Okay,
good.
so
Yeah.
there'll be something that people can look at that's
Yeah.
an actual example, a real
Right.
example.
Although there won't be very specific details. Not everybody is as willing as I am to reveal
Reveal the
how much it costs.
reveal
But I give you
dollars.
a general ballpark sense.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's good. So, I mean, obviously, any of us going around this area sees an increase in
Yes.
solar on roofs or
Yes.
next to buildings or on the garage next to the house and stuff. So people are doing this.
Oh, yes.
And-
And towns are doing it too. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's actually, considering the fact that Amherst is trying to put up a solar farm on its closed landfill, I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about the situation across Western Massachusetts, because there's really a lot going on in Western Massachusetts. There are at least 9 systems that are either functioning now or being built or in very good planning condition that will be supplying power for some of the towns in Massachusetts, 9 different towns, and there are several others that have been put up by WEMCO, and several others that have been put up by municipal utilities. And these are just the town and utility level solar farms. There are also a lot of smaller projects, projects to power a school, as in they do in Northampton. And there's the proposal, both the one at UMass and there's one proposed for Belchertown, although it's getting local resistance, to pilot a small solar farm raised on poles above the farm so that the farmer can continue to raise cattle or even crops and combine those with generating solar power. And that's an interesting potential for the future.
I know I've seen pictures of cows under solar collectors. That looks easy enough. I guess if the crop doesn't need full sun, that would work. You could go spinach or something at it.
And I think it would get quite a bit of sun,
yeah,
probably, depending on...
Right, because it's not total shade all
exactly.
day. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If I were a cow, I'd find the shade very attractive.
Right, you wouldn't have to go find a tree. You could just stand under your...
Now, most of these town facilities are producing in the vicinity of 2 megawatts. And the basic rule of thumb is for every 1 megawatt, you need 5 acres of land.
Okay.
So for these 2 megawatt plans, they generally use about 10 acres of land. And most of them are on closed landfills. A few are on former industrial sites, and some, like the farm ones, are on somebody's cornfield. But I think the state of Massachusetts has really been encouraging towns, to put up solar farms on their capped landfills because it's a reasonable way to make the landfill productive. It can be productive for other uses. And it's also probably less likely to meet resistance from the neighbors, although
usually
that isn't the case in Amherst, but it seems to be generally the case in Western Massachusetts that people have been willing to accept. There's one in Greenfield that's almost finished, for example, and one in East Hampton that's going up.
Well, I know one of the power companies has been putting up a small one right next to Route 63 up in Northfield.
That's First Light.
First Light,
that owns the Northfield Mountain facility. Yeah.
Which I think, I mean, it will generate some power, but they're also just trying to show. They obviously put it right next to the road so everybody can see that it does work.
Atkins Market has a small solar facility just out behind the market.
Yeah, where the new building is.
I don't know what its capacity is.
Right,
but, it's there.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think all of us, if we think that climate change is a serious issue and stuff like that, we're going to have to get used to looking at solar panels and windmills and things like that instead of just, continuing to get our electricity the way we always have, none of which is clean either.
No, absolutely not.
So like natural gas pipelines or coal blowing up mountaintops or whatever.
It's terrible. Yeah.
We surely will see these because one of the characteristics of renewable energy like solar and wind is it's very diffuse. You need a lot of area to capture a significant amount of energy.
Right.
That makes it difficult for big wind farms onshore and makes the offshore particularly attractive in that case.
And you didn't mention the objection to wind, which is sometimes heard, which is the damage it does to bats and birds.
Yes, and that's not the only thing either. But in the case of bats and birds, why, very little hard data exists. There are a number of studies. The National Research Council did a study which gathered together all of the information on wind farm fatalities to bats and birds and came to the conclusion that it was anywhere from about 1 to, I think it was 12 birds per megawatt per year. Doesn't mean much.
Right.
To put it in context, that's anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands times smaller than the number of birds killed by house cats. And yet,
and
you
yet
know, we're human beings. We're used to that, and I can't feel too outraged that someone who loves his or her cats will not be able to tolerate a wind farm because it'll do damage to birds or bats. That's we're people. We react in different ways to different things.
Right. Also windows, especially in tall buildings.
Oh, yeah.
And some people are very, very annoyed by wind farms and assert that there's a real health syndrome that they call wind turbine syndrome. The state of Massachusetts commissioned a study committee. One of the members came from UMass to study this. So they studied the entire literature of the area. And it's quite a thorough study, and concluded that there was no such thing as wind turbine syndrome, although wind turbine flicker and the noise can annoy people sometimes. There's a group, an organized citizens group, that opposes wind called Windwise Massachusetts, and they've asked for the state to have a moratorium on all wind facilities. And they've completely rejected this report.
Right.
There's not a meeting of the minds on it, so this is another issue that people are going to argue over.
Right. And in the meantime, the climate gets warmer, the sea levels rise, the ice caps melt. I don't know. I mean, it just seems like there are no easy solutions.
No, there's a price to be paid for all of these things. None of them are perfect.
The price is less, I think, with solar, and that's one of the pluses of solar. Solar is quite safe. You don't have to worry about human health or birds and bats or animals. The big negative with solar is the cost, but hopefully that's going to go down over time as technology increases and in terms of the scale being used.
Another attractive thing about photovoltaic solar and wind farms is that they do not use water. Every thermal plant, like a gas facility or a nuclear plant, uses water as a cooling source. And in fact, a plant like Vermont Yankee actually has to diminish power sometimes in the summer because adequate cooling water just isn't available. The Connecticut River's temperature is already raised by the presence of Vermont Yankee using the water as cooling water.
Right, and again, that's an impact that most of us, unless we're really into fish, probably
it's invisible
know
to most of us.
Very little about. And then, of course, the Connecticut River also has several major dams, which probably also contribute to warming up the river, and certainly contribute to blocking the fish. So, and have for 200 years in many cases. So, there is no simple answer to all this. So.
No, and I think the answer in terms of renewable energy lies in combining a number of different kinds of sources.
There's a safety to that diversification too, because if the price of one suddenly goes up for some reason we can't anticipate, it doesn't throw the whole system out of kilter. It's just a small part of it. Or if the supply, say the petroleum supply, gets cut off, you're not so vulnerable to it if you're producing 50% of your energy from petroleum. That's a poor example because it's much too expensive to make electric power that way in the U.S., never mind New England. So that only about 1 or 2% of our power is actually generated with oil in New England.
But right now it's mostly natural gas. There's still
About
coal.
half, I think.
There's still coal,
Still nuclear.
about a quarter coal, 20% nuclear.
And then the rest of it, well, probably
The
mostly
renewables are about, I seem to
Less than
remember
10%,
something, less
aren't
than
they?
8%, I'm going to say. Wind is a little bit, is less than 2%.
currently.
Massachusetts has a state goal of 250 megawatts by 2017, and it looks as though we're going to generate it from solar power, and it looks as though we're going to get there.
Oh, specifically from solar power?
Specifically from solar power. And given the way the megawatts installed have been increasing lately, I think we're definitely going to get there, which is good. If we had time, I would love to talk a little bit about concentrating solar power, which produces the huge plants that you sometimes read and see about. But I have a suspicion we may be running out of time.
I don't think we actually have more than a little over a minute or something to, probably wouldn't be adequate to get into that. But that's not a New England likely
desert
thing,
climate, so can't have it up here as long as we don't have deserts in New England.
Right. So basically for true, quote, alternatives, it's solar and wind that we have.
Photovoltaic.
And photovoltaic,
And
right.
wind, yep.
Yes, and wind is by far the more practical right now. If there's going to be a major renewable
For utility
increase,
size.
renewable energy increase in New England, it's going to be wind in the near future.
Yeah. Although I think we could get pretty imaginative about where we put solar collectors.
Absolutely.
It's true, but it's hard to deploy a sufficient number of them to make a large percent impact. And it's not to say that they wouldn't be generating a lot of energy. That's just a measure of how large the energy business is. 1% of the energy business is enormous.
There's been a calculation that for a concentrating solar power facility it would have to cover over 5 million acres, but it would supply the whole electricity needs of the United States.
Well, but that'd be what, the state of Arizona or something?
Yeah, I mean that would be huge. So these big things take up a
Right.
lot of space.
I mean, that's not, obviously, that's not
Not
really
very
going to
doable.
happen.
No.
Yeah. Nor do I think that we're going to convert the whole of Cape Cod to
No.
solar. On the other hand, it seems to me that Cape Cod is going under the waves, in the next century anyway, not all of it, but much of it. I would think they'd be in favor of things that would slow that down.
You'd think.
I don't know, we'd have to ask them, I guess.
Yeah, right. This is the Amherst League of Women Voters here. So as we wrap this one up, and we're looking forward, the next show is going to be Dick talking about nuclear power, but in terms of the alternatives and the efficiencies and geothermal and stuff like that we've talked about, it seems like we need some of all of it.
Yes.
Or as much as we can of
Definitely.
all of it in order to have a genuine and actual alternative energy.
Well, one of the things that we've maybe presented this time is to show how difficult it would be to come up with energy to replace what we'd lose if we turned the nuclear plants off.
I may ask Dick that question. Well, I want to thank you for watching, and this, as I said, is show 2 of 3, and the next one will be about nuclear power. And I want to thank Susan and Peter for coming in and participating in this show.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks. Bye.